Hello everyone, I'm Sarxos and I'm a big fan of speedrun world record progression videos. As such, I've been wanting to do something similar myself for one of the games that I run, such as Europa Universalis 4. The only problem has been that for a long time, most leaderboard categories for these games simply haven't had enough of an official speedrunning history to really make such a video for. However, recently there is one category that has presented itself as a potential candidate. It's a fairly short and simple run, but one which has had a surprisingly interesting development of strategies across the roughly 1 year it has existed on the EU4 leaderboards. It's also one which has been so optimized that I'm pretty sure we won't be seeing any further strategy progression for it ever again. So all that being said, without further ado, let me present the world record progression of Europa Universalis 4, Pyramid of Skulls. But before we get into that, I feel I should give a brief overview of Paradox Grand Strategy speedrunning in general. Within our community, every category of every game is divided into 2 different subcategories, each of which tracks the records using fundamentally different timing methods. One of these is RTA, real-time speedruns which go by the actual real-life hours, minutes and seconds, much like as speedrunning is typically done in non-Grand Strategy games. The other is IGT, in-game time, which is based on completing objectives as early as possible going by the in-game date, which is the more conventional and popular form of speedrunning within the broader Paradox community. In RTA runs, the maximum game speed, speed 5, is generally banned due to how highly dependent it is on your computer speed, giving people with better computers a massive unfair advantage. Instead, the norm is to compete in a category called RTA No Speed 5, or RTA NS5 for short. This category restricts the runner to use at most speed 4, which has a built-in cap on the game's frame rate, making things a lot more even between players provided their computer is fast enough to reach that cap in the first place. In this video, I will be covering the world record progression of both the IGT and the RTA NS5 subcategories, but the primary focus will be on the IGT one, for the simple reason that it has had substantially more activity and is also where nearly all the major strategy improvements for the category were initially introduced. Now let's talk about what the category actually entails. Pyramid of Skulls is one of the many in-game achievements that have been added to EU4 over the years. It requires you to play as a Steppe Horde and make use of their unique racing mechanics to race a province with a total development of at least 30. When you race a province as a Steppe Horde, you permanently reduce its development by a substantial amount, but in return you gain a big one-time bonus of monarch power, which is partially related to the amount of development you destroyed. Only provinces which are directly owned by you, but which you don't have cores on, can be razed, which means you can usually only raze provinces that you have recently conquered from somebody else. The most obvious way to complete this achievement is to conquer a province that already has at least 30 dev, for example Beijing, and then racing it to the ground. But even before this achievement became a speedrunning category, there had been some alternative strategies proposed. One such strat suggested that instead of conquering a province that already has 30 dev, you instead conquer a reasonably high dev province, manually develop it yourself until it reaches the required threshold, then grant it back to its original owner, before conquering it again and finally racing it. The reason you do this territorial flip-flopping is that you can only develop a province if you have a core on it, but as mentioned earlier, you can only race a province if you don't have a core on it. So, after developing the province, you give it back to its previous owner in order to get rid of your core, then conquer it back so that you can race it. No known recorded speedruns were ever done with either of these strategies, but the latter of them did inspire the first recorded speedrun that was ever submitted to the leaderboard. The run, submitted on the 9th of June 2020, was done by a certain little known runner named Sarxos, which is to say, me. I did a run. Hello, how are you? The strategy used in this run was based on the idea of finding a way to manually develop a province to race, but without the need to conquer and reconquer it just to get rid of your core. So what I did was to play as Uzbek, hire 3 level 2 advisors, and set my national focus to diplomacy. Then I paused the game and let it run until exactly April 1st, 1447, which is the date where I have just enough accumulated monarch power to do the following. I release Kazakh as a vassal, which removes all my cores from their territory, and then I develop their province Kipchak from its initial 8 in development all the way up to 30. Then all that's left is to seize Kipchak back via the vassal tab and race it in order to complete the achievement. This ended up giving me a final in-game time of 2 years, 4 months and 21 days. Shortly thereafter, on the 22nd of June, I also did the first official RTA NS5 run, which used the exact same strategy and ended up with a real time of 3 minutes and 55 seconds. And thus, the category had gotten its first official world records in both of the two subcategories. Obviously, this strategy is very passive and not all that exciting, but it did introduce a few things which would continue to be relevant for most of this category's history. The main thing is the idea of developing one of your own provinces to 30 dev and then getting rid of your core by giving the province to a vassal before seizing it back. It also established Uzbek as the country to play and Kipchak as the go-to province to race, because it has the highest starting dev out of all provinces that are owned by a Steppe Horde at the start. My initial streak as the IGT world record holder would not last long though, as just 2 days later, on the 11th of June, another runner made their debut in the category. The illustrious Archduck. With the power of epic meme thumbnails on his side, he took my original strategy and conceived of a number of improvements. First, he expanded the usage of the whole release vassal and seize back their provinces concept by releasing Siberia as a vassal, and through some Liberty Desire manipulations, he managed to seize back 2 of the provinces, which he can then raise for some bonus monarch power. Second, he made use of the Encouraged Development State Edict in order to lower the development cost of Kipchak by 10%, and did some of the development before releasing Kazakh. He still had to do most of the development after releasing Kazakh however, in order to help bring down their Liberty Desire below 50%, because otherwise he wouldn't be able to seize Kipchak from them. With these efforts combined, he managed to lower the IGT record by exactly 1 month, claiming the world record with a time of 2 years, 3 months and 21 days. Despite Archduck's improvements, the majority of the strategy still came down to just passively waiting for monarch power to trickle in over time, but all that was about to change. It had already been speculated early on that you could probably save time by conquering some provinces from your neighbors in a quick war, which could then be raised for extra monarch power. This theory would now finally be put to practice as a third runner enters the scene: Frims. Nowadays, Frims is mostly known for his CK3 speedruns, but way back in his shameful past, he actually used to be an EU4 runner, and in his first attempt at the Pyramid of Skulls category on the 28th of July, he immediately goes on the offensive as he declares war on his neighbor Chagatai, who is allied to Nogai. What follows is a two-front war where Frims is forced to split his attention between the two belligerents. He avoids any direct battles at first, rather sending his infantry to occupy the 2 enemy capitals, while splitting off his cavalry to occupy the many non-fort provinces. He eventually manages to beat down Nogai, and after carefully referencing the development map mode, he pieces them out for 3 provinces that each have enough development to be raised. What then remains is to clean up Chagatai, which ends up taking a fair bit of time, since even after occupying their capital, he still needs to fight off their armies, occupy most of their non-fort provinces, and retake some occupations on his own lands. But eventually he's victorious and can piece them out for 5 of their provinces. After raising his new conquests, he proceeds to release Kazakh, develop Kipchak and then seize it right back, to finish off the run with a race of glory. This nets him a time of 1 year, 10 months and 29 days, which is a huge improvement over the previous record. Clearly, the new aggressive strategy is working really well, but so far it's somewhat crude. For example, in this first run, Frims ended up delaying the declaration of war all the way until February 4045, and he hired no mercenaries or additional troops. He also likely let the wars drag on for longer than needed, since he had a rather sizable pool of spare monarch power by the end. So the run still had plenty of room for improvement, and it didn't take long before Archduck was back to reclaim his #1 spot. What then followed was an epic battle between Archduck and Frims over the world record title, which would see them continuously trade a record back and forth several times over the coming weeks. In his next run on the 31st of July, Archduck borrowed the idea of conquering his neighbors, but introduced a number of improvements. The most significant one was that he recognized that going after Chagatai just wasn't worth the hassle, and that focusing entirely on Nogai was the way to go, and for good reason. Out of all of Uzbek's neighbors, Nogai is certainly the most efficient target, as they only have a level 1 capital fort relatively close to Uzbek's border, and a territory that isn't too large, but still contains plenty of provinces ripe for racing. Archduck also made sure to get some allies in Great Horde and Chagatai, in part to dissuade them from allying with Nogai. This seemed to work as intended, as Nogai's only ally in the war ended up being the relatively distant Ajam. Additionally, Archduck had some excellent luck. He rolled a free siege general, got an estate agenda which would give him an extra 50 admin power from conquering one of the guy's provinces, and later on he also received an event which just so happened to reduce the development cost of Kipchak by 15%. He managed to pull off a decently efficient war which saw him acquiring 5 provinces from Nogai on November 1st, 1445. Despite all of this, Archduck decided to play things very safe. To make the most out of his monarch power, he once again made use of the Encouraged Development State Edict to develop Kipchak halfway to the target dev before releasing Kazakh, and then developing the remainder after releasing them. Developing Kipchak prior to releasing Kazakh is more efficient thanks to the edict, but due to their size and historical rival modifier, keeping Kazakh's Liberty Desire low enough to seize back Kipchak in the end can be a bit tricky if you don't make use of the Liberty Desire reduction from developing their provinces. So Archduck aimed to split it half and half. Even this wouldn't be quite enough though, so to further boost his monarch power he reintroduced his old Sibir strats and seized one of their provinces to raze. This, along with waiting a few extra months just to be safe, let him finish the run on January 2nd, 1446, with a time of 1 year, 1 month and 22 days. On the 2nd of August, Frims struck back with a run that beat the previous record by about a month, ending on December 1st, 1445. In this run, Frims managed to win his war against Nogai not much later than Archduck had done in the previous record, but due to Nogai being allied with Chagatai, they were a bit more reluctant to make peace, so Frims only managed to snag 4 provinces from them. On top of that, he didn't quite share in Archduck's good fortunes, so he couldn't get the extra 50 admin power from the state agenda, nor did he get the minus 15% dev cost modifier on Kipchak. So with all these disadvantages in mind, how could he still manage to clutch out the record in the end? Well, first, it turns out that Archduck had played it a bit too safe in his previous run, which meant he ended up with a lot more money power in the bank than he actually needed. Second, to compensate for getting 1 less province from the guy, Frims instead managed to grab 1 more province from his vassal Sibir after the war. And to compensate for missing out on the bonus dev cost reduction that Archduck got, he made the most out of the Encouraged Development Edict by developing Kipchak all the way to 30 without releasing Kazakh. The only issue is that if he would then release Kazakh, he wouldn't benefit from any Liberty Desire reduction gained from developing the province, which would make it difficult to get her Liberty Desire low enough to seize back Kipchak. The solution? Just don't release Kazakh at all, but instead release the 1 province minor Khiva, and grant them a series of provinces all the way to Kipchak. Because of their much smaller size, Khiva's Liberty Desire proved to be much easier to manage, which meant that it was no longer a problem to develop Kipchak all the way to 30 before giving it to a vassal. With these improvements, Frims managed to get the world record back with a time of 1 year and 20 days. After this, there finally was another improvement to the real-time version of the category, as Frims submitted the first RTA run using the more aggressive approach. In terms of strategy, it was essentially identical to the IGT version, involving a war against Nogai to raise their provinces. The only difference lies in the execution, which was less careful and precise in favor of faster real-time, avoiding the pause button as much as possible and making sure to prepare a peace deal before the end of the war, so as to not waste any time with sending it once the war is over. As Frims himself stated, his execution wasn't great, but the new strat was so much faster than the old one that he still beat the record by half a minute, ending the run with a time of 3 minutes and 25 seconds. Meanwhile, on the IGT side of things, Archduck was once again back on the case. On the 6th of August, he reclaimed his record by 2 in-game days. In this run, he had a phenomenal luck to find a merc company led by a 5-seat general, and he found a guy once again solely allied to a Ajam. Unfortunately, in spite of this, his enemies proved tougher to crack than expected, and he was eventually forced to settle for a minor victory, grabbing just 2 provinces from the guy. At this rate, to beat the record, he would have to somehow conjure up no less than 4 provinces to raise from his own vassals, a never before seen accomplishment. He released Sibir and Khiva and grabbed 1 province from each of them, but that still left him 2 provinces short. So he then also released Bashkiria, but through a truly insane series of actions, he managed to keep their limited desire down enough to seize 2 provinces from them to raze, and still have enough leeway to also grant and seize back Kipchak from them in the end. Unfortunately, these actions are a bit difficult to make out in his original video due to the choppy recording, but it involved granting a bunch of provinces, turning Bashkiria into a march, and fiddling around with all sorts of vassal interactions. Thanks to this never-ending persistence, he took the world record back with a time of 1 year and 18 days. Sadly for him though, he would only get to relish that record for a single day before Frims yet again took it from him. There really isn't much in particular to say about this run, it was just the most cleanly executed one thus far, allowing Frims to make peace with Nagai for 5 provinces and seize 2 more from Siberia. Thus, he raced his way to a new record of 11 months and 5 days, the first ever sub-1 year time. At this point, Archduck's interest in the category seemed to have waned, and he would not return to challenge Frims' record. That doesn't mean it would stand unopposed for long though, because on the 19th of August, the world saw the glorious return of me. I finally decided it was time I made another serious contribution to this category after I had originally kicked it off over 3 months prior. In terms of strategy, I only really made one significant improvement. I had done a few tests to come up with ways to reliably get most of Nagai's potential allies out of the war early, so that once you beat Nagai themselves, you would be able to enforce a 100% peace deal on them. In this particular run, Nagai ended up allied to Chagatai, which I could sign a separate peace deal with anytime I wanted, simply by giving them a bunch of my provinces. Obviously this wouldn't be ideal in a normal game, but the nice thing about speedruns is that you really don't have to worry about the long term at all. With that, all that was left to do was destroy Nagai's armies and fully occupy their country, the latter of which was made a lot easier thanks to an amazingly lucky Siege 5 general I found on one of the merc companies. Since I had already gotten rid of Nagai's ally, I could take no less than 9 provinces from them in the peace deal, which is more than enough and meant I didn't even have to seize any additional provinces from my vassals. Thus, after lots of racing and developing and racing again, I took back my old world record with a time of 9 months and 25 days, an improvement of about a month and a half. At this point, the strategy had been more or less worked out, and the biggest remaining limiting factor was the siege RNG of Nagai's capital. It was recognized that to get an optimal time, you would have to begin that siege as soon as possible, and then be lucky enough to get a breach on the first siege cycle to enable you to assault the fort, something which only has a 1 in 14 chance of happening per siege cycle. Nonetheless, Frims was determined to take his record back, and so began the grind for an early breach. While he didn't have such luck at first, on the 30th of August he still managed to beat the record by a single in-game day, ending with a time of 9 months and 24 days. By his own admission, this was not the time he was aiming for, but he found the situation funny enough that he still wanted to upload it. But then the grind continued, and on September 9th, 2020, he finally got that early breach he had been looking for. Granted, the breach didn't come until the 3rd siege cycle, so a fair bit later than optimal, and Frims made the mistake of not paying close enough attention, which meant he wasted several days before he noticed the breach. No matter, with a quick assault he would still be able to finish the war faster than ever before, and to ensure such an assault would be a success, he employed a particular advanced assault strategy developed by Lambda X.X. If you want to learn about the strategy in detail, I would recommend watching Lambda's own video on the topic, link in the description, but here's the general gist of it. You divide your army into 1 assault stack and 1 reinforced stack, the latter of which must be constantly moving toward a neighboring province. After starting the assault, you carefully progress the game 1 day at a time, constantly consolidating your assault stack and switching out any damaged regiments for a full strength regiment from the reinforced stack, and then keep repeating that until the fort has been taken. This strat will consistently let you win assaults every single time, at least provided you're not too far behind in military tech. After winning the assault, and separately piecing out the guy's ally Timurids, Frims could demand 7 provinces from the guy, and then grab 2 more from Siberia, and finally end the run on June 20, 4045, a time of 7 months and 9 days. After this, activity in the category died down. Even though Frims' record was far from perfect, and in his own opinion was played pretty bad, No one seemed interested in putting in the RNG heavy grind required to push the record lower. Hoping for a first or second cycle breach, each with only a 1 in 14 chance of happening, while avoiding any major mistakes, just didn't seem like a fun time, and there were plenty of other categories to focus on. As such, Frim's record continued to stand unopposed for many months. But then, suddenly, something happened. Archduck mentioned in the EU4 speedrunning Discord that he was back to working on Pyramid of Skulls, and that he had a strat that would, quote, shock the world. Excitement and anticipation filled the air. What was this new strat? How would the legendary duck reclaim his record? Little hints were dropped. Great Horde. Primary culture advisors. Bully Gazimuk. Archduck admitted he wasn't sure if he would actually be able to make it work, but after such a dry spell in activity, anything with even a chance to stir the pot was welcome. And then, on the 10th of February 2021, Lambda X.X dropped by to inform us that he had casually obliterated the previous record with an in-game end date of January 13, 4045. That's right. 5 real-life months after the previous record was set, this guy effortlessly destroys it by 5 in-game months. And by all appearances, he hadn't even thought of it until Archduck started talking about his potential run literally the day before. So, okay I guess. Well, to be honest, this shouldn't come as too much of a surprise. After all, Lambda is the same guy who did a world conquest as the Oirat Horde by 1531, and revoked the privilegia of the HRE as the same by 1487, using his own patented Lambda Revoke strategy. Needless to say, he knows this game, and in particular he knows his hordes. So apparently all he needed was a little nudge to get going wrecking the competition in this horde-focused category. Alright then, so how did Lambda manage to bring the record down by as much as he did? The key insight is that when you release a vassal from your own territory, the fort in their capital actually starts out with a garrison of 0 men, which won't receive any reinforcements until the end of the month. As long as a fort has no garrison, you can always capture it after a single siege cycle, as if there was no fort there at all. With this in mind, Lambda's new strategy essentially came down to the following. He would release Siberia as a vassal in early December, then declare war on them on the earliest date possible, December 11. Before doing that though, he would prepare by spreading out his starting armies as much as possible across Siberia's core territories, so that once the war begins, he would instantly have a full carpet sieging operation up and running. And thanks to the aforementioned situation with the 0 garrison capital fort, he could 100% occupy Siberia in one single siege cycle. There are only 2 issues with this strategy. The first one is that Siberia doesn't have enough raceable core provinces to gain the required monarch power this early in the game. Fortunately, this can be easily solved by simply granting them a few additional provinces after releasing them, which can then be conquered back. The second issue is that, while Uzbek's armies start out very conveniently placed for this strat, it's not quite possible to reach every single one of Siberia's provinces before it's time to declare war. But Lambda found a way around that too. A few of these troublesome provinces can be seized through the vassal interaction menu before the war, eliminating the need to occupy them at all. As for the rest, while his regular armies can't reach them in time, he can still get some boots on the ground by hiring mercenary companies in each of these provinces, and by strategically choosing which companies he hires, he can make sure they all finish recruiting before December 11. By the time he declares the war, every single one of Siberia's provinces will be covered by Uzbek soldiers. Then it's just a matter of waiting for one siege cycle to complete, and practically all of Siberia will be occupied, including their capital. After the ensuing peace deal, Lambda had no less than 10 provinces to raze, and that's a good thing too, since by aiming to complete the run so early in the game, he would barely get any passive monarch power from monthly ticks, and would have to rely almost entirely on racing to fill that need. But with the help of the encouraged development state edict, it ended up being just barely enough to get Kipchak up to the required 30 dev. After a brief moment in the hands of Kiva, it could then be raced to complete the run with a new world record time of just 2 months and 2 days. This new record truly appeared unbeatable. Not only was it incredibly quick, but unlike the old strategy, it actually didn't rely on any luck factors whatsoever, so there was no point in grinding for good RNG either. The only way to speed things up will be if it was somehow possible to reduce the duration of that one siege cycle. And wouldn't you know it, That's exactly what the next world record submission managed to do. After having his moment of glory rudely swept away from under him, Archduck was determined to squeeze out the last drop of time save the category still had left to give. So, on the 12th of March, he performed a run where he copied Lambda's world record strategy almost beat by beat, but with one key difference. By sending a merchant to the Siberia trade node, he managed to get enough trade power there to enact the trading policy Improve Inland Routes, which grants plus 10% siege ability in that node. This happens to be enough to reduce the duration of the sieges against Siberia by 2 whole days, letting him get all the occupations he needs to end the war as early as January 11. Unfortunately, due to diplomacy restrictions, you have to wait a full month after declaring war before you can send a peace offer, so it's not possible to actually end the war until 1 day later, on January 12. But that's still 1 day earlier than Lambda achieved in his run, and 1 day is all you need to become a world record holder. Consequently, 7 months after he last held the title, Archduck was once again back on top, with a time of 2 months and 1 day. With that, the IGT record now looked pretty darn optimized, but the RTA version of the run still had plenty of time to save, in no small part because it had been woefully underappreciated with only 2 submitted runs to date. In an effort to rectify this and regain the world record title, I returned to the category on the 17th of March with intent of adapting Lambda's new strategy for a real-time run. The overall idea of the strategy remained the same as in the IGT version. Spread out your armies across Siberia's core provinces, release Siberia, declare war on them, win the war in a single siege cycle, and then race to your heart's content. But in order to optimize for real time, a few modifications had to be made. First, declaring war and then making peace at the earliest dates possible is not as essential in RTA as in IGT. Thus, I could let my regular armies take their time to spread out, eliminating the need for recruiting mercenaries or seizing provinces before the war. Second, since in-game time isn't inherently important in itself, I could comfortably leave the game unpaused for essentially the whole run, letting the months pass by to bring in some extra monarch power that way, which meant I wouldn't have to raise quite as much. I still ended up granting Siberia 1 extra province before the war just to be on the safe side, but any more than that wouldn't be necessary. Beyond that, the run looked largely the same as the IGT version, only executed as quickly as possible, making use of hotkeys and speedy carpet siege strats. When all was said and done, I had achieved an improvement of nearly 2 minutes over the old record, ending with a time of 1 minute and 32 seconds. Well, there you go. The RTA record still had a lot of room for improvement, but as for IGT, Lambda's brilliant new strategy had already become as optimized as it ever could be. Even if you could figure out ways to finish your occupations on Siberia a bit earlier, it wouldn't matter, because you'd still be limited by your diplomats. With December 11 being the earliest date you can declare war, and January 12 being the earliest date you can make peace, there simply was nothing more that could be done. It seems that Archduck would continue to reign supreme, as we close the book on the Pyramid of Skulls IGT World Record history. And then Lambda beat the record literally without unpausing the game. Yeah. You heard that right. After everyone thought the category was dead, this freaking guy comes back and beats it without passing a single in-game day. What the duck? Okay, how can this be possible? We've already established that you can't possibly sign any peace deals before January 12, 1445. So how do you manage to pull this off on November 11, 1444? Well, it's simple. You don't sign any peace deals, because you don't declare any wars. Rather, you just seize and raise enough provinces from your own vassals to obtain the required monarch power. But doing this as Uzbek is, most likely, impossible. They have 3 potential vassals they can release at the start, but getting more than maybe 2 provinces from each of them just isn't going to happen due to liberty desire constraints, and this isn't nearly enough to get the monarch power you need. So for the first time in the category's history, we're going to have to move away from Uzbek, and instead set our sights on the descendants of Tamerlane, the Timurids. But hold on a minute, I hear you say, the Timurids aren't even a Steppe Horde. You're right, of course, if you play on the current version of the game. But if you turn back time all the way to patch 1.22, things are a bit different. In this ancient era, Not only were the Timurids a steppe horde, but they also started out in direct control of their territory, being able to selectively release vassals as needed. With so much territory and so many vassals, they had better potential than anyone else to do all the racing they could ever need. But that's not all. Lambda also discovered another crucial glitch/exploit that had been patched out of later versions of the game, but was still possible in 1.22. The trick was that when you turn a vassal into a march, it completely resets their liberty desire. This means that, no matter how much you've pissed your vassal off by seizing and razing their lands, it will all be forgotten by a simple click on the diplomacy screen, which consequently enables you to seize and raze even more of their land. Armed with this knowledge, Lambda got to work, painstakingly releasing and feeding his vassals one province at a time, seizing back the provinces he wanted to raze. And once liberty desire got too high to handle, he simply turned the vassal into a march and got right back to it. This way he managed to snag 1 province from Khorasan, 3 provinces from Kokand, 5 provinces from Khiva, and a whopping 8 provinces from Ardalan. After racing them all down, he began developing the province of Khuzestan, a good candidate for the job as it starts at a respectable 15 development. Once again aided by the encouraged development edict, he managed to get it all the way up to 30 with a bit of monarch power to spare. Now, in order to raise Khuzestan and finish the run, Lambda first had to give the province to a vassal and then seize it back again. But at this point, all his vassals were pretty pissed. The least angry one was Khorasan, but even they were well above 50% liberty desire, and since Lambda had already used up all his diplomats, he couldn't simply use the march trick to get rid of it. So he tried pretty much everything else instead. He could grant them a bunch of additional provinces, and also use the placate rulers interaction once, but that wasn't quite enough still. Fortunately, he had one more trick up his sleeve. As mentioned earlier, he managed to do all the developing he needed and still have monarch power to spare. This proved to be very helpful, as that meant he could spend that extra power on developing one of Khorasan's other provinces by a few points, which was just enough to bring the liberty desire down below 50%. And thus, he could seize back Khuzestan, raze it to the ground, and claim his world record of 0 years, 0 months, and 0 days. Those of us who believed Archduck's previous record was unbeatable were rather firmly proven wrong by this run. But at least this time I can say with 100% certainty that Lambda's new world record actually is, quite literally, impossible to beat. As long as IGT measures its records based on the number of in-game days passed, you simply can't do better than 0 days. Not unless someone figures out a way to make the date go backwards anyway. So this time, we truly can close the book on the Pyramid of Skulls IGT world record history. Now that the IGT category had been fully optimized, the only thing that remained was the RTA one. Unfortunately, even though the new Timurids strat was literally perfect in terms of in-game time, it was actually quite slow to execute in real time. Therefore, it actually wouldn't save any time in RTA over the previous strategy. But if an alternative 0-day strat could be found, one which was quicker to execute, then that could be a huge development for the real-time category. And by the grace of Johan Andersson, with the release of the Leviathan DLC, one such strat was indeed found. Since I'm apparently the only one who even cares about the RTA category nowadays, it was once again I who got to set another world record using this new strategy that I developed, which saw me return to playing Uzbek. After almost a year full of runs that revolved entirely around manually developing a province to race, this was the first run that technically didn't, for the most part anyway. Instead, it revolved around the new concentrate development mechanic, which allows you to leech a bit of development either from one of your non-state territories or from one of your vassals, and funnel it into your capital. When you use concentrate development in an area, you extract up to 3 development from each province whose development is sufficiently high. But if no province meets that requirement, then you can't use the interaction there at all. Furthermore, after you've concentrated development, there's a 50-year cooldown before you can do it again in that same area. However, if you then hand those provinces over to a vassal, then you can actually bypass that cooldown and use the interaction again, provided the provinces still have sufficiently high development. In fact, each country has a separate cooldown for each area, so if you pass a province between different vassals, you can concentrate development once for each of them. Uzbek starts out with 6 states that have high enough development to use this mechanic on, and one which has such high development that it can even be used multiple times. I am of course talking about good old Kipchak. So even though it's no longer the province that will be raised in the end, Kipchak still gets to serve a vital role, as we're gonna have to concentrate development there no less than 3 times over the course of the run. Now let's go through everything that happened in the run step by step. I begin by spending what little monarch power I start with to develop my capital twice, which turns out to be crucial to getting its development high enough in the end. Then I turn Kipchak into a territory and concentrate development there. Then I release Khiva, turn them into a march, and use the send officers and subsidize armies interactions to lower the liberty desire as much as I can, which will be important later. Then I grant them a series of provinces which include Alti-Kuduk and Kipchak. Then I concentrate development in Kipchak a second time and also do it once in Alti-Kuduk and Karakalpak. Once that's been done, I seize Kipchak back, which is the reason I had to lower Khiva's liberty desire earlier. Then I release Sibir, and just like with Khiva, I turn them into a march, and then use the interactions to subsidize armies and placate local rulers to lower their liberty desire. Then I grant them Kipchak and concentrate development there for a third time, before also concentrating development in every other available state. This incidentally also includes my own capital state, which I couldn't concentrate development in before, but since Sibir gained a few of the provinces there when I released them, I'm now able to do it for them instead. With all that done, my capital has now reached exactly 30 dev, so now I just need to get rid of the core I have there, which immediately presents a problem. In all the earlier runs of this category, we get rid of cores by granting the province to a vassal, but since this is my capital we're talking about, that's not possible to do via the vassal interaction menu in this case. Fortunately, there is another way. Sibir actually starts with a core in Uzbek's capital, but when you release them as a vassal, they still don't receive ownership of it due to its capital status. But if you look at the Rebels tab, you'll find some Siberian separatists, and if you accept their demands, you'll cede every one of Sibir's core provinces to them, including your capital. But crucially, they will still remain a vassal, which means that after manually abandoning my core via the province tab, I could seize the province back as normal and then raze it. This ended the run with a time of 49 seconds, beating the old RTA record by 42 seconds, and also tying the IDT record with another Seer Day time. And that is actually where the record stands today. It's by no means perfect, as I fumbled with my hotkeys a few times, and it's also possible that the details of the strategy could be tweaked a bit to make it slightly more efficient. But so far nobody else has stepped up to the challenge, which means that, for the time being at least, the RTA NS5 World Record History Pyramid of Skulls has been concluded. And that also means that this video is essentially concluded as well. Thank you very much for watching, and a special thanks to Archduck, Frims, Lambda X.X, and Mikkelmar for letting me use clips from some of their videos in this video. And an additional thank you to Archduck for letting me use some of his original compositions for parts of the soundtrack. All of their videos and music will be linked in the description. If EU4 speedrunning sounds like something you'd be interested in, you're very welcome to check out the leaderboards over on speedrun.com, and also join the EU4 speedrunning Discord. Or if you're interested in more than just EU4 speedrunning, then maybe check out the general Paradox speedrunning community Discord as well. All of these will also be linked in the description. Anyway, that's all for me, so have a good time of day!